Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll let people kind of flow in, and we'll give it a couple minutes to let anyone who wants to log in. But if you're here, why don't you say hi in the chat? Tell us where you're from. Love to know who's joining us today. Make sure my phone's on silent. Oh, nice. People from all over. Awesome. Well, welcome, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think Andreas is excited too.
Yep, I am.
We'll give it 2 minutes, and then if anyone, as people kind of flow in. Welcome, Daniel, Switzerland. I don't know what time it is there, but good evening, probably.
Say about the same time as here.
Andreas, tell everyone where you are.
I'm based in Germany, so happy to see that there are more people from Europe here.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to see people from all over. Not seen anyone from Japan, so nobody's getting up at 1 in the morning to talk to us, I guess. Bummer. We'll send them a link. And just so everyone knows,
we did have some inquiries for recordings from Australia, right?
Perfect. Yeah. We will be sending out the recording as well. It's probably at the same time, similar time as in Australia as Japan, right, Andreas?
Yeah, I'd assume so.
All right. Well, in about 2 minutes, I'll give it 15 more seconds so that we're 3 minutes on the dot, and then we'll get started. But we really appreciate you all joining us today. We're looking forward to going into depth on the Wheelhouse pricing engine. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So we'll get started. Welcome. I'll just repeat pretty much what I just said. We're going to be going in depth today on the Wheelhouse pricing engine. It's going to be a lot of fun. My name's John DeRelay. I'm a revenue management expert and enterprise sales head at Wheelhouse. So if you like kind of what you see or you're interested in learning more after this, please reach out to me or reach out to the Wheelhouse team. And I'm joined by Dr. Andreas Buschermohle. Is that pronounced correct?
Yep, that's getting it pretty close.
pretty close is pretty good. More or less accurate than our recommendations.
I'd say a little less accurate than our recommendations, but close enough.
Yeah, and so Andreas, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your time with Wheelhouse?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi everyone from me as well. I am a co-founder of Wheelhouse. So I've been here for the last 7 years nearly, and initially started just on the data science side, working particularly on the pricing engine. By now I am running our product and engineering departments. So not just data science anymore, but taking care of the broader product role here. But still very much involved with our pricing engine and have a pretty good overview, I would say, of the complete history of how we've come to where we are today, and also how the different pieces play together, how the pricing engine then flows into our product and into the front end that you guys are seeing on the website. So excited to dive into those details a bit more and explaining more of how we get from the data to the final recommendations that end up in your hands.
It's going to be pretty exciting. Andreas is the brains behind the operation, and he could probably be the face too, but you got to give something to Andrew. I know Andrew's in here, so he heard that. I hope he's laughing. So if you haven't heard of Wheelhouse, we'll go into that just briefly. I don't know how you would be here if you haven't heard of Wheelhouse, but if you haven't, Wheelhouse is a full suite pricing platform and revenue management system. What we do is we look at the specifics of all of your listings, and we develop a daily rate plan for you based on market conditions, the specifics of your listing, and changes in the marketplace. We probably have the best, most dynamic, market responsive algorithm in the space, and we price thousands and thousands of properties all over the world. We make these listing specific rates automatically and push straight to PMSs and channels. We also give you the tools to fully customize your rates, to access and override or make changes. So whether you're a high touch revenue manager who's really in their rates, making minor adjustments every day, or you're someone who really just needs the help to manage something that's very complicated, we provide a solution that can do either for you. We also have a number of business intelligence tools, from market reporting as well as custom comp sets. These are pretty new and we're really excited about them. So in terms of a full suite, from pricing to information about your markets and your properties, we're offering a number of great options with an excellent focus on UI, usability, and a great team. So what we're here today is to talk about the specifics of the data science behind the pricing engine itself. I'm sure if you've talked to either myself or anyone else on the team, we've probably sent you some really, really in-depth blogs because we have published our research on this. But we wanted to talk with the man himself, Andreas, the brain behind the brain, and figure out what's going on. So I'll kind of let you take it off from here, Andreas. Feel free to correct anything I just said. Take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you want to go back to the overview slide just briefly so we can talk a little bit high level first and then go into the individual pieces of the engine? Mm-hmm. So looking at this image, this is really the top level abstraction around the pricing engine and the top level components that flow into our price recommendations. And you can see the starting point is our base price. Our base price is kind of the foundation of every recommendation. That's the average price across the year. And then the daily fluctuations, time-based fluctuations, and things like that come on top of that anchoring point. For the daily fluctuations, we're then looking into demand. And there you can already see it's splitting up into two different approaches that we're taking and getting together into one system. We've got the predictive demand on one hand, the reactive demand on the other hand. We'll go into those in a little bit more detail to explain what the differences are, where the benefits are, and then why we're still using both and not just relying on one of them. Those two demand models are then blended together into a single demand-based price adjustment for every stay date. And finally, those are the two pieces we won't get into too much detail today because they are not so much data intelligence based, but more automation based, which is temporality and vacancy gaps. So some automatic adjustments. That's the nice part, I would say, around a automatic price recommendation engine. It can leverage data and utilize automation that way. And on top of that, because it's a machine, because it's running regularly, it can just do those regular updates as the stay date comes closer. Temporality can kick in and adjust pricing, or we can automatically detect vacancy gaps as your calendar fills up and also react to those. So those, I would say, are more on the pure automation side versus the data-driven side of things. Yeah, with that, maybe let's look at the base price model first. So the base price model is, as I said, the baseline and also the first thing that we started to develop 7 years ago to try and understand what is a listing worth on average for an average demand day in a market. So for this, we're looking at the essential features like the number of bedrooms, the number of sleeps, what kind of room type is this, where is the listing located, what market is it in, what is your setup in terms of cleaning fees, extra guest fees, how many guests do you allow to stay, and so on. And all of those basic features influence our base price recommendation. To figure out what we should be recommending there, we are looking at prices that listings in the market are achieving on average. So we look at their average nightly rate and utilize those features to try and predict what the average nightly rate of each listing in the market is, and fit a model to that so that we can predict that as accurately as possible. And one important thing to consider on that front is not every listing in a market is performing well. So there might be listings that are just too cheap, getting booked all the time, and have a very high occupancy at the cost of total RevPAR. At the same time, there might be other listings, especially in the Airbnb market, where not everyone is doing this as a professional, that are occupied very little, only have maybe a few days per month booked at all, and might just be overpriced, that causes them to not get these bookings. So one important feature that is impacting our base price model is the occupancy that each listing in the market is actually achieving. So that while we're training the model, we take a look at that occupancy and utilize the occupancy also to try and forecast the average nightly rate of that listing. And then when we utilize that trained model to predict or recommend a base price for each of your listings, we plug in an expected occupancy for that number so that we get the right base price that would be the best choice if you wanted to achieve that target occupancy. And that target occupancy, again, is derived by medians from the marketplace to see where does that market typically end up in terms of occupancy. So, yeah.
Sorry, are all of these components and features of the base price, are they relative to the other properties within a market, or are they compared to like all the data that we have, or?
Yeah, so it's we're typically divvying up our data into markets for this, and then within a market are looking at the impact these features have on the average nightly rate that a listing can achieve. And obviously different features have different relevance there. So in this example on the slide, you can see bedrooms is one of the most important features because it already sets the relative size of the listing to figure out what the listing should be priced at. Then other things like cleaning fees or extra guest fees are less important, but also have some impact. And the first step of our model is really looking at those basic features of a listing, irrespective of any particular location. So really taking all the market data into account. But then obviously we know within a market, different locations also are very different. That's what kind of the right side of the slide is indicating. We're running something called spatial kriging. Essentially, you can think of it as if every listing in the neighborhood of one listing achieves higher prices than our market-wide average base price model comes up with, that neighborhood must be a nicer neighborhood than the rest of the market. Versus if every listing on average achieves much lower prices than what our base price model comes up with, that neighborhood must be a less nice neighborhood. And that's how we derive a neighborhood or location factor that also impacts our final base price recommendation, and just might increase or decrease it depending on the location within the market. And then the third part on top of that is the actual pricing history that the listing has. So if the listing is just a much nicer listing than the average 2-bedroom apartment in that area, then it might have achieved better rates in the past. And that performance is also taken into account as a quality factor on that listing to increase or decrease prices on listing specifics and utilize that.
Awesome. And just so everyone knows, we haven't announced it yet, but we will be surfacing up within our platform more detailed analysis and descriptions for you of not only the components of the various models, but also how we're understanding your base rate. So stay apprised of that coming from Wheelhouse, but transparency is our thing. Do you want to move on to the next part, Andreas?
Yeah, I think we've covered the base price in great detail, so let's move on to the next one. And that's the predictive model. Again, it's kind of also historically the first one that we developed after the base price model. And the predictive model is mostly looking at prices in the market, that is pricing from other short-term rentals and from hotels, to see where are prices going up, where are prices going down, and utilize that pricing signal as some form of intelligent forecasting of actual demand. So piggybacking on the entire market and the entire intelligence of the market, we can see if a lot of hosts start to increase their prices around certain stay dates, that must be a high demand period. And the benefit of this method is it's pretty early on. So it might not be perfectly accurate, because maybe there's next to collective intelligence also something like collective ignorance. People might think there is a big event, but actually there isn't. So the signal has to be taken with a grain of salt. But the benefit is it's really an early indicator. People oftentimes go in and increase their prices pretty early on once they see an event announced or something. And that means we can already start recommending different rates pretty early into the time frame of the booking process before the actual bookings start to happen. And in this case, we're not just using all the data in a market, but we're dissecting it in different ways. We've got the seasonality part of our price recommendation that is using the entire market and heavily filtering the short-term spikes out of that data. And on the other hand, we're also looking at events, but for events, we're getting more local, because events have a typically more localized impact on the market booking patterns. So we're only looking at the local surrounding listings of a particular listing for which we're making a recommendation to come up with the actual recommendation for the event-based part. And that way, splitting things up into seasonality and events helps us localize the impacts of the things that are local versus utilizing more data and more information for the things that are more global on a scale. And then bringing those elements back together to form one predictive model-based recommendation. And yeah, as we can see, the pricing, obviously, as I said, might be wrong, and that other people are applying in the market. One famous event I always tend to quote there was the visit of the Pope in Washington, no, in Philadelphia it was, a couple of years ago. And what we saw in the data was so many hosts thought this is going to be a big event. Everyone is coming to town. All the places will be rented out. So everyone started increasing their prices. But the thing we also saw then was many more people, because of these price spikes, started to offer their place on the platform and wanted to buy into that opportunity. So actually, the supply increased so much that in the end, all these high price listings never booked up. And that is something where you really need to look at the actual booking signal. So pricing is one input, but the more important part as you get closer to the stay date is actually looking at bookings that happen versus the supply that is available in the market. And with that, we come to the next slide, the reactive model.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate, I think that that's a pretty big piece, right? That we have, both a pricing and a bookings model. And why that's so unique is, we've heard from a number of companies that are kind of entering the space, like Buoy and stuff like this. Their criticism is like, oh, it's not just a scrape pricing model. We have bookings. Well, we've been building and training a booking-based model for 7 years. And so not only do we have the data and the experience, but we were really early in understanding that you have to combine the knowledge of both in order to make an accurate pricing recommendation.
Yeah, and especially around special events or special circumstances, this is coming in very handy. The example shown here is from early in the COVID pandemic, so we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a bit. But first, high level, the other one, the predictive model, was based on pricing in the market versus the reactive model now is based on actual booking activity. And we look at how much occupancy did a stay date already achieve. And then together with the lead time, so how far out is the stay date still, we can forecast what the final occupancy is going to be and compare those occupancy levels to each other to come up with a final demand that we expect. And the nice thing about that is in the Pope visit use case that I just mentioned before, we then see actually supplies increasing so much that total expected occupancy isn't going to be that high. So all the high price listings won't achieve the prices that they are trying to set. And our reactive model can take over as that signal strengthens and actually bring down our recommendation to more realistic levels again from the initially very high levels that we might have recommended due to the price-based model. And similarly, we can see here early in the pandemic. So we've got, on the one hand, the recommendation for this listing as it was on January 1st for a listing in San Francisco. And then we see the same listing and its recommendation for March 15th. So right around the time when things started to shut down. And very in the immediate near-term future, demand really significantly dropped, and our price recommendations followed that by really going down on our demand curve as well and dropping much more below the initial baseline that the model was forecasting. At the same time, the midterm future still stayed about the same. But another interesting thing is that a lot of the events that we initially had detected to come up also had been canceled and were immediately reflected in our reactive model as well. The cancellations happened, so prices shouldn't be as high anymore as they used to be because of the events. And those things are immediately reflected. Similarly, if you know San Francisco, Dreamforce is one of the biggest conferences there, which was the event at, I think, early November in this graph. And at that point, it had not yet been canceled. People were still hoping that it might happen. So prices had come down due to the overall anxiety around the incidents, but not yet canceled. So the price recommendation for Dreamforce still stayed relatively high at that point. So I think that's where those two models kind of come into play. The predictive price-based model has the benefit that it can pick up signals early before actual booking activity happens, but it is by its nature inaccurate because it's just based on people's guesses. And then the reactive model can kick in once actual booking activity happens and we get more concrete information about demand and can react to that demand and bring prices up or down depending on the real influx of bookings that we see for the different listings.
And how often are we doing this, Andreas?
We're recomputing both models for all the listings that we're observing every day. So once a day, we get in the latest data and we refresh all our recommendations based on that.
Awesome. To the next model?
Yeah, let's move on. Essentially, the next one is the combination of these two. So as I mentioned, both have their benefits and their drawbacks. The reactive model doesn't really have a lot of data to go on early on, so in the far future, versus the price-based model might not be perfectly accurate. So the more we can rely on the reactive model, we want to do that. And that's why we're blending both together. And maybe if at some point during the animation when we are at the blending curve, if you can pause the animation there. So it's
I can't pause the animation.
Oh, you can't.
It's a GIF, so it just rolls.
Yeah, at least you can see here right now the booking, the weight of the blending. In the near future, we essentially put a lot more weight on the reactive model because by then we already have a very strong signal. In the far future, we put lower weight on the reactive model because we don't see that many bookings yet, which means we can't rely on it too much yet. And in between, you also see the blending is dynamic. So for an event, we see a more significant signal early on. So we can already early on blend in the reactive model much more severely. And for lower demand days, we don't see that strong signal early on, so we've got to rely more on the price-based model. And that's where dynamically, depending on how reliable each of the two data sources is, we blend these two models together and try to make the best prediction based on the data that's available at the time.
Can you go a little bit more into what you mean by non-linearly? Like how do you know to use the reactive or the predictive more?
Right, yeah, we're looking essentially at the bookings that have happened for a stay date, for example, early on. So that might mean if the stay date is still a year out and we're in a market with 5,000 listings, that only 5 listings got a booking so far. And typically we would expect an average stay date to get 3 bookings. So 5 out of 3 bookings, 5 bookings versus 3 bookings is still, it's a little bit higher, but not very significant. And that's where we apply statistical significance to try and understand when is the difference in the observed data so much different that it's relevant for predicting the outcome. And essentially then if maybe for the same stay date, 100 days forward, you end up at 80 bookings for that stay date versus on average, you would only have 30 bookings by then for a normal stay date. You can see that is much more different, much more significant from a statistical perspective. And that's where we can start relying more on the reactive model. And essentially with that statistical significance, depending on the lead time and the number of bookings that we have observed versus the number of bookings that we would expect to observe for a normal day, we can be more and more sure that our forecast of something is different than average gets more and more realistic. And that's where we put more and more weight onto that reactive model.
Awesome. Do you want to move on to the next model, or any other touches on the how we blend these together and mix it all up?
No, I think we're actually moving into some more advanced concepts now. So this is kind of the high level. And as I said, we do have temporality, we do have vacancy gaps at the end, which are also automatically incorporated into our recommendations, but less data driven. And that's why we skipped on them in this webinar. But wanted to dive a little bit more. I think particularly the reactive model has some very advanced concepts behind it that we wanted to dive in a bit more to explain how we actually try and understand this booking process particularly.
Awesome. So before we move into this, there's a couple questions that I saw that I just wanted to address before we get super crazy and only 5 people in this room understand what you're saying, including yourself, Andreas. But you're gonna expand our minds pretty big here. The first was someone had asked early on, sorry, I forget your name, but at a high level, how does our model differ from Airbnb's auto pricing?
Well, obviously they didn't publish as much detail about what their algorithm does, so we don't know all the specifics. But from the things they have published and from what insight I could gain from that, I think the overall approach is very different. In terms of my understanding of Airbnb's auto pricing is it is forecasting the price in a very large decoupled machine learning model that is more of a black box. So you put in some inputs in the beginning, you get out a recommendation in the end, and you don't really understand what's happening in between. That's kind of magic. Versus in our case, I think that in-between part is a little bit more designed, which also is called somehow some kind of white box or gray box model. So you can understand the internal parts, you can understand how things work together to come up with the price recommendations. And I think that's also a huge benefit in terms of learning over time, not just the model itself, but also us looking at the model, improving it over time and seeing which pieces are working well together, which pieces are not working well. So I think it's a more understandable model. And I also think, well, this might not be as relevant for the customer of ours, but from a technical perspective, a very efficient model to relatively quickly calculate it for millions of listings worldwide. So yeah, I think it's a different approach with more insight into the forecasting process that we take.
Both Andreas and I have been operators too, myself with Stay Alfred previously and Andreas while Wheelhouse was part of Lyric. And, at the end of the day, our model is good and the pricing is like, will maximize your revenue. Airbnb is just pretty much undercutting. Like we've not only heard that, but experienced it. It's a very low recommendation model. And like Andreas said, it's hard to figure out why. One more quick question before we moved on to the advanced concepts. where is our data coming from, Andreas?
We do have a couple of data partnerships. The latest one that we, I think, just announced is with Key Data. So Key Data is our main data provider going forward to get worldwide complete coverage of all the listings on Airbnb and Vrbo. So that also means that in the near future, we are expanding our market coverage significantly. So stay tuned if you're currently seeing your listing as out of market. That should definitely change in the next few months. Then next to that, we have other partnerships with data providers and direct PMS integrations. So essentially pulling in data from a couple of different places that we all connect into a unique format and then can leverage the same way in our recommendation engine. And next to that, we also are looking at hotel data that we have for not all the markets, but for the majority of markets as well worldwide. So combining those two things as well, short-term rentals and hotels.
Awesome. Well, let's dive into some of the coolest and most crazy stuff to talk about today. So everyone get your thinking cap on.
Yeah, so this is really the foundation of the reactive model that we are using. And the foundation is called survival models. If you've ever been involved in statistics, you might have seen this more in the medical area. So it's called survival models for a reason. It's typically used to monitor application of new medication and seeing how different medications affect the survival rate of patients that have some severe illness. And the idea in our case is we're treating each room night as a patient that we actually, in our case, don't want to survive. We do want it to book and die in that way. So that's the analogy that we took. And then using that survival model, also known by particularly the Kaplan-Meier estimator, to come up with booking curves. And the nice thing about this survival model approach is that it implicitly deals with censored data, what's called in statistics. And this is a case where we inherently have censored data. We do have listings that were initially blocked off, so they weren't available to book. So we don't know if they had been available, would they have gotten the booking at this time? And then at some point they might get available and then eventually get a booking. So we've got to figure out what do we do with that left tail of the early booking process that we couldn't observe because the host didn't offer that listing. And similarly, we've got the right tail because sometimes hosts, again, block off their calendar and do want to go to that place themselves, for example, and use it on their own so they can't rent it out anymore. Or the right end is still blocked off because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, and we're just at today so far. So it might still get a booking in the future. And similarly, if it did get a booking, maybe if that booking hadn't been accepted, it could have gotten a booking at a later point. And these kinds of censoring events where we don't see what would have happened if the listing had been still available at those points is implicitly taken into account by the survival model analysis. So that's also why when we look at our booking curves and the kind of occupancy number that we get at the end of it, it's not the same as if you were to take the booked nights and divide them by all the available nights, because these censoring events have an impact on this estimation. But in the end, I think the high level, stepping back out from that technical detail, what's interesting is we get with this a booking curve that tells us over time, how is this group of data that we're looking at booking as the lead time progresses towards day zero, the day when the stay date is. And the other nice thing is we can group any kind of data. So for example, we can look at all the listings, no matter what type of listing in San Francisco. Or we can take a look at only the one-bedroom listings in San Francisco and see what does the booking curve look for that subgroup. Or what we're doing a lot for the reactive model, we can look at one particular stay date and see what does the booking curve look like for that particular stay date. And that way analyze the booking process, compare the booking process between those different groups, And maybe just diving into the example image that we have here, we see 3 different markets and then one particular group of stay dates. It's not just a single day, it's a couple more. But we do have kind of as the lowest booking curve here, the Lake Tahoe market that has a pretty steady booking process, speeds up a little bit towards the end. I guess that might be, so this is really taking all observations across all time into account. So it's including summer, it's including the spring weekends where people go just for skiing. So I think that pickup towards the end might very well be due to those skiing events where people decide more spontaneously. But overall, a pretty steady pickup. Compared to that, we also have Maui in there as that dotted blue line, which has a really static pickup all the time from early on and already starts with a pretty high occupancy, like more than half a year out. That's the typical destination markets where people plan their vacation early. They kind of plan their vacation all the time. It's not so much short-term driven. Comparing that to the San Francisco curve that we have in there, it actually stays lower than Maui quite a while and then only picks up at the very end and has a lot more short-term bookings in the last like 60 to 90 days. And that's what we see in a lot of city markets. But again, as you see, Tahoe is kind of a mix of the two, where you have that long-term big vacation planning, but then also some short-term skiing weekends that are spontaneously planned, and a mix of the two. And the other interesting thing in here is actually the Dreamforce curve. So for this very specific event in San Francisco, we can also just look at those stay dates and what booking activity looked like for those, and see that much earlier bookings already increased in San Francisco and ended up obviously also at a much higher overall occupancy, because the entire market nearly booked out. I think it's pretty typical for San Francisco to bring in even a cruise ship to accommodate additional people to stay, because all the hotels, all the STRs are booked out for that event. So it's really a high compression event that impacts the market. And if you take a look at these curves, you can also see early on, 200 days before the stay date, there is already a quite significant difference between the Dreamforce curve and the overall San Francisco curve. So 200 days before the stay date, it's already expected that the curve will end up at a much higher occupancy, and we can already leverage that in our reactive model to drive the demand forecast.
So Andreas, we are able to do this. So each individual stay date could potentially have, or does have, its own survival model, right? Is there pretty significant differences? Like if you just took like just Lake Tahoe, for example, and you looked at one day in July and one day in December, are those going to be different?
Well, depends on which day you pick. If you pick December 24th and July 4th, probably pretty similar because both are big events. But if you pick other days, yeah, obviously there is going to be a huge fluctuation throughout the year. So what we really do for the reactive model is we build these survival curves for each individual stay date, but not just that, but also for each listing where we do recommendations. Because as I mentioned earlier, we've got the seasonality part to our recommendation and the local events. And there the focus really is on local. So for a listing, we look at a certain distance from that listing and its local neighborhood, and just take all the booking events that happened in that group of listings for that particular stay date. So considering that we have, I think, about 3 million listings in our database, that means for 3 million listings, we're building these booking curves for 365, or by now we're going out 18 months, so it's even 400 something dates every day. So it's really a huge crunching of numbers, but that's where what I mentioned earlier really plays an important role. Our approach is very efficient, so we can still do this for a market like New York with 60,000 listings easily within something like 10 seconds. So it's a very efficient approach to quickly crunch a lot of numbers in a lot of different ways and get those individual booking curves for each individual stay date and listing.
That's awesome. What that really, like, maybe to put that in layman's terms is I think a lot of revenue managers understand the concept of booking window, but what we're able to do using the algorithm is understand each day's specific booking window for every specific listing.
Yeah, right.
Awesome. Any more on survival models before we move on to the next mind-blowing piece of the...
I think we can move on to the nice gamma warping, which actually, this is not a term from standard literature, but more a term we coined internally. So you won't find that anywhere, but what we're doing here is we're leveraging those booking curves to understand how can we derive a demand signal from that. And the problem there is you want to have different demand signals, not just depending on is this booking curve twice as high as the average demand in the market, but if average demand is very low, then twice as high might not be that interesting, versus if the average curve already is pretty high and the market generally tends to book out much more, then just a 10% increase in the booking curve might be very significant. So what gamma warping does is it really transforms two booking curves that we have, and that might also be one booking curve that we know all the way to the end, to the final stay date, and one booking curve that we might only know until 180 days before. But comparing those two and transforming it into one value that tells us is the demand high, average, or low, and gets us some insight into that demand scale. And I think, as we can see on the right-hand graph, the interesting thing there is if you have a low gamma, or let's say you've got an average gamma of 0.5. The scale doesn't really matter, but it's above 0 means there is higher demand than normal. If the market in total has a very low booking probability, in the extreme case 0, even a gamma of 0.5 means we're still expecting 0 occupancy. So that's the far lower left point. On the top right point, you see if we expect the market on average to have 100% occupancy, then with a gamma of 0.5, we still expect it to be 100%. And in between, there is this non-linearly shaped curve, which actually reflects that for higher baseline probabilities, higher baseline occupancies in a market, smaller increases already get us more quickly to a high expected occupancy, or vice versa. A small increase in the occupancy that we see already tells us a much higher demand, expected demand much earlier. So there is kind of this nonlinear behavior, and you can easily see that if a market is already 90% occupied from normal demand anyways, then a big event will have a much bigger impact on your abilities to drive price, versus a market that's only occupied 30% most of the time. Big event might sell out the rest of it, but still doesn't really drive price because it doesn't really cause any shortage in supply through all that. So gamma warping is our way to transform different booking curves into our internal representation of demand. And the other nice thing here is really this comparison of booking curves opens up so many possibilities. One of them is, I think, the baseline of our reactive model by looking at booking curves for stay dates compared to the market average. But you can do so many other interesting analyses. You can look at all the one-bedroom listings compared to the market. So you can see what's the impact on booking probability or the demand for one-bedrooms compared to the market average. Similarly, you can take a look at what's all the weekend. I can take all the weekend dates in a market and compare them to the weekday dates and see what's the impact of weekends on demand for those stay dates. I can look at all the listings that have a pool versus all the listings that don't have a pool and see what's the impact on bookings. So it's really a universal way of comparing different sets of data and telling us what's the impact this particular thing has. So I think in the future, right now, we're not surfacing a lot of this, but I think there is a road in the future where we can give much more insight into those particular things. how are different factors impacting your market, and how is that impacting our demand signal that we're internally seeing.
Awesome. So are we doing that in the model right now, relating these different categorical and time factors for the price that you mentioned?
Yeah, so for the seasonality, stay date, and day of week parts, so in the reactive model, we have those three components. We've got the seasonality model, we've got the local events model, and the day of weeks model. And those are essentially grouping things differently, either to try and tease out the seasonality part of it, to tease out the individual stay date part of it, or the day of week part, where we can see weekend effects. Then at the same time, we are using this model to tease out the impact of different amenities and how those should be impacting our base price model. So yeah, we are leveraging these kinds of groupings and comparing groupings in different parts of the model under the hood.
Awesome. This stuff is pretty complicated, but it's really, really cool to listen to and understand, because as we know, hotels have some pretty advanced revenue management, but their products are essentially commodities. They don't have to deal with the problem where not only are all these availability changes and supply changes happening in the market, but there's very little consistency between the products themselves. So we have to find a way to relate them in order to price them on the same channels, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's one of the fundamental differences in the SDR market, that it's so vibrant and changing all the time. Supply is coming online, dropping off the market, and you kind of never have a static image that you can easily compare to the past. Where again, the benefit of survival models comes into play, where the censoring of these events is just inherently taken into account into this modeling.
Awesome. Well, let's move on. I mentioned, Alice mentioned she can only hear me. Is that the case with anyone else? Because I can hear Andreas.
That would be very unfortunate.
Okay. Bryce can hear us. Amelia can hear us. Okay. Okay, we'll move on.
Sorry,
Alice, we will be sending out the recording though. So if you missed a portion, that'll you'll be able to access that as well. So what do we got next, Andreas? Price response function?
Yeah, the price response function. This is kind of where the two previous, or a lot of the previous things we discussed come together. So here we are utilizing the survival model, we're utilizing gamma warping, and we're utilizing the base price model. And all three together tell us this price response insight. And the graph on the left actually still looks about the same right now, but we teased that out of the data, I'd say 1 year, 1.5 years into the company. So about 5 to 6 years ago. And that's really the most interesting insight that I guess we got early on, because it's really showing price matters in this market. The price that you set for your listing has an impact on your likelihood to get a booking. And it's not just that people want this listing no matter what, but it's really the price that has a significant impact on your likelihood to book. And to get a bit more into how we do this, we're taking our base price model, which comes up with a recommendation for a price for each listing that we observe. Then we see what the price the listing actually charged was, and we see if it got booked or not. And if we take the actual prices, the listing charges, compare them to the base price recommendation that we come up with, that's essentially forming on that left chart what we call price delta. So some indication of, was it priced higher, lower, or about the same as our base price model would recommend. And then we can utilize the booking curves and the ability to group data in any way we want. And we just pick all the stay dates that were priced about 10% higher than our base price model would recommend. And take those data points, they might be different stay dates from different listings at different times, but taking all those data points to form a booking curve. Then we take all the listings that are about, or all the listing stay dates that are about 20% higher price than the base price model recommends, and form a booking curve for those, and so on and so on. And then we've got a set of different booking curves for those different buckets of data. And for each of those booking curves, we can then take our gamma warping to figure out what is this gamma factor that we derive from that booking curve. And that's what you see as those dots on the left plot. So essentially for each bucket, we get some gamma factor that tells us in that bucket, your likelihood to book or your demand is higher or lower than average. And then what we do through that is actually fitting this more streamlined curve that tells us how is a price delta impacting your likelihood to book, which internally is our gamma factor. And you can quickly see as the price delta goes up, so above 0 means prices are higher than our base price model would recommend. The gamma factor, which is the likelihood to book, decreases. So it's less and less likely that you get a booking if you increase your pricing too much. And on the left-hand side, you can see as you go below our base price model, the likelihood to book increases, but eventually levels off. So it's not that you can decrease your price arbitrarily and just entice more and more bookings, but at some point people get curious, don't really trust the listing anymore, whatever the reason, they don't really book more often just because the price is lower. So that's, I think, two interesting insights that we then transform into how we utilize or transform expected occupancy into a price factor in our recommendations. That if there is very low demand and you lower your price too much, that doesn't help you anymore. And there should be a bottom line that you don't decrease below. Similarly, if there is very high demand, or if the demand increases, let's say that first above normal, then you can kind of linearly increase. So double demand means double the price, and that's still a reasonable expectation. But then on the right-hand curve, when you get to the far right side, and you really have a compression event like this Dreamforce in San Francisco, where the demand is so high they need to bring in cruise ships to accommodate all the people, you can really skyrocket your price as well. So essentially, the more you get towards full compression of the market, the more you can start increasing your price more than linearly and get really high rates for those specific events. And that's where kind of our internal modeling of the price response function, and then how we transform that into our price recommendations really helps the price adjustment being based on not just the demand that we're seeing, but also the overall occupancy that we're expecting to increase prices at first only linearly, then maybe exponentially, and to lower prices only so far and not to lower it beyond the point where it won't drive revenue anymore.
And are we generating this for every single stay date again, like same with the survivability models?
So the price response function on the left is generated on a market by market basis. So each market might have slightly different way that customers are responding to price differences. And then the right-hand side, this is a snapshot of one particular case where we've got one baseline occupancy and one expected occupancy for the stay date. But the shape and overall, kind of curve might look different for different baseline occupancies, different markets, and different price response functions. So I'd say the general shape is most likely pretty similar, but it might be different depending on the market and the stay date that we're doing this for. Yeah.
And do these change or get updated as conditions change in the market over time? Maybe not like over time, like a day or two, but over longer periods of time.
Well, this is, again, something we do run every day. So as new data comes in, we refresh all the models and refresh all this again. But obviously, it's taking in a huge amount of data. So the daily increment in data changes won't have a big impact right away. But over time, these models do have some slow drift depending on how market conditions change. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, we've got about 6 minutes left scheduled. I think, do we have another? I think that actually is, oh, we do have another piece here. So why don't we hop into that one, unless, and if you want to say anything else on the price response function as well. You're welcome.
Yeah, I think we do have actually this one and one more. So maybe I'll be a little bit shorter on this one so we can also cover the validation part because I think that's very interesting. So going into competitive sets, we just recently released our competitive set functionality. And one thing I do want to highlight at this point is competitive sets play a role in our price recommendation engine, but they are not the only thing taken into account, because in the end, competitive sets to us are more relevant for comparing how you are doing and analyzing your own performance, versus for the recommendation engine, other listings that are not direct competitors still give relevant data in terms of demand signals. So even if you're not competing with the 5-bedroom across town, it still helps us understand, is this a high season or low season? So the competitive sets play a role in the recommendation engine, but other data points, other listings also do play a role because they still are an indicator of demand. Yeah, but taking that aside, so the way we are looking at comp sets, we wanted to, by design, prevent us from selecting comp sets based on performance, because in the end, if you're a high performer, you want to see that you're high performing compared to your comp set. You don't want to just pick other high performers and see again that you're in the average of the pack. So we are deliberately not looking at performance data at all to come up with our comp set recommendation. We're just looking at the listing features around bedrooms, bathrooms, room type, amenities, our internal quality indicator that we have, and the location. And then we essentially have 3 different kinds of listings. On the one hand, we've got the listings that are just for that market too far away to be considered a competitor. Then we have the listings where those basic metrics for the listing differ too much, so we don't consider them similar enough to be competitors. And lastly, we've got the other ones that are similar enough, close enough, and are considered competitors. How do we figure out those metrics, as they are called here? So it's not just that we look at the difference in bedrooms, the difference in bathrooms, the difference in room type. That's where you already get kind of problems, because room type doesn't give you a number as a difference. And how does that compare? Like, what's the difference between an apartment and a house versus 1 versus 2 bedrooms? Those things are not easy to compare. So what we're doing is we piggyback on our base price model. The base price model already helps us understand those features of a listing in terms of their impact on price. So we already know an apartment versus a house, that's a price increase maybe by 50%. Similarly, we know what the impact is of a bedroom change from 1 to 2 bedrooms. So we've got that impact of the individual features in terms of price in the base price model. And then we are building a similar model to the base price model to forecast occupancy for each listing. So we can see how are all of these basic features of a listing related to the price that the listing can achieve and related to the occupancy that the listing can achieve. And then for this comp set selection, we look at listings where the expected price and the expected occupancy, not the real price, not the real occupancy, are reasonably similar. So that's how we can indirectly value the impact of those features and find similar listings even in these non-easy to navigate spaces of different room types and bedrooms and amenities. And how is that conglomerate of things actually impacting similarity?
One thing to note is that, as Andreas said, competitive sets are only a component of the pricing engine. We do have a tool available on our website, which is a business intelligence tool to surface some of this data up for you. And because we know that, you know, comp sets means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, that functionality allows you to create your own comp set, as well as see a comp set that we're drawing from our system as well. All right.
Yeah, maybe taking the last few minutes to at least briefly touch on the model validation part, because that's, I think, also very important. It's not just that we come up with a recommendation engine and then let it run. but we are validating internally how well that recommendation engine is performing. And obviously that's, again, not easy, because to do it perfectly, you would want to have the same listing under the same conditions, tried out for different approaches, and see how the outcome is going for those. But obviously you can only have either slightly different but similar listings, or you are looking at the same listing at different time periods. And that's why we are actually looking at 3 different indicators of performance. We've coined them the control improvement, the historical improvement, and the model accuracy. The control improvement means we're taking the comp set that we just discussed, pick out of that comp set all the listings that don't dynamically change their price or are not using our Wheelhouse price recommendation, and compare the performance in terms of RevPAR per sleeps for that listing, that group of listings, to the listing that uses Wheelhouse pricing. That means the listings are slightly different. They are not perfectly identical, but at least they are observed under the same market conditions. So it's the same stay dates, the same demand, same location. And that also turns out to be one of our most stable measurements that we have over time. So that one typically ranges somewhere in the 20 to 30% range, and shows us that on average 20 to 30% more in terms of RevPAR per sleeps is doable using Wheelhouse pricing versus not using Wheelhouse pricing. The other one, and I see the graph is missing on the right, but the historical improvement, we're looking at the same listing that is using Wheelhouse pricing and compare its performance since it turned on Wheelhouse pricing to what it was like before it used Wheelhouse pricing. There, the benefit is we have the same listing and the listing doesn't change, but obviously we're looking at different time points. So demand might have changed significantly coming out of low season into high season, or vice versa. So that one also shows positive numbers, but fluctuates much more throughout the year as seasons come and go, and we're going into and out of high and low seasons. So that's where we've got a less stable measurement, but it's still a good indicator of where our recommendation engine is. And the third one that we're looking at, we're trying to look at the same listing at the same time, but that's only doable in a hypothetical comparison. So we're looking at the actual revenue that listings priced through the Wheelhouse pricing engine are making compared to the revenue that we internally expected. And on that one, we're typically expecting something around 100%, so that the actual revenue actually is exactly the same as we expected. And on this 30-day average, we did get to 99.29, so pretty close. That, again, might fluctuate a bit more between somewhere at 95 to 105%, but typically is very close to that 100% range, which means in total, we've been observing this for at least 3 to 4 years now. We can very confidently say we've got a high accuracy in terms of that model accuracy measurement, and in terms of that control improvement measurement. We estimate that the improvement from using Wheelhouse pricing is somewhere in the 20 to 30% range.
Awesome. I've also heard from Andrew, our CEO, a couple times that we've worked with partners to develop some of our methodologies on our models as well. Can you speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, these validation methodologies were not just us internally developing and verifying that we're doing a good job, but we did work with TripAdvisor in this case to verify the model for a test. And that's where these measurements were instantiated, and what we're still using to this day to validate internally that things are going correctly.
Awesome. Great. Well, I think this has been quite a lot of information in an hour. Is your throat sore, Andreas, from chatting so much?
Totally fine, but I guess that's the benefit of us recording this, so people can rewatch if there are particular pieces of it that might be interesting to revisit a second time.
Absolutely, yeah. And we, just so everyone knows, on our website, on our blog, we have a number of articles that go into both more simple terms as well as more detailed terms on a lot of the concepts that we talked to today. We try to be very transparent with the work that's being done here, so that is publicly available. We'll also be continuing to publish information about how we're doing things as we seek to become more transparent in the marketplace, as well as within our platform itself, offering a variety of tools and visualizations to show you the specific parts of this model and what we're doing and recommending. And we're very, very excited to do that. So if you have any questions for us, please reach out to the email on the screen. If you're not a user of Wheelhouse, we would love to talk to you about how we might be able to help your portfolio and work with you via our variety of integrations we have with PMS, Channel Manager, and Channel Partners. And Andreas, really appreciate your time. This was phenomenal, and we know you're really busy. So
yeah, well, we should definitely do this again and get some more info out in the world and be more transparent. So I love it.
Awesome. We will be sending out the recording, and if I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, so please just reach out to us directly, and we'd be happy to start a conversation.
Yeah,
thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
How do I close this? Oh, here. Bye.
Bye.